What I'm going to be talking to you about today is I've called it Doing Things with Shakespeare at a Chinese University. So I'm going to be thinking about doing Shakespeare, but also doing things with Shakespeare. And in order to do that, I'm going to be sharing a kind of interactional approach to intercultural language education. As I said, though, because this is a very international, interdisciplinary bunch, and I try and make my research a very interdisciplinary affair as well, bringing in everything from kind of literature, drama pedagogy to intercultural language education, methodologically, conversation analysis, membership categorization analysis. If we think about interdisciplinary work as being about kind of making connections, building bridges and making connections between things, that's the dream, that's the ideal. But I always sometimes feel like when you're on those bridges, making those connections, sometimes you can be left on your own. You're in between, kind of not one thing, not another. And it can be a slightly lonely place where you're a bit worried that because you're trying to bridge all these different things, no one is quite sure what you're actually talking about, or no one necessarily cares. So it's wonderful that you're all here for me to talk to and talk at. Let's hope by the end of me talking, you're still here and interested in what we're doing, but we'll see. So thinking about whether or not people know what you're talking about, obviously this face here, this face which I've seen an awful lot over the last few years, everyone knows the name. Most people will know the face, but obviously what people think about Shakespeare, whether or not they actually care about Shakespeare, there can be all kinds of different attitudes towards it. His fame, this kind of status that he has, can be a very useful way in, but it can also be a problem in certain respects. So what I'm going to talk about first of all is why Shakespeare. If I'm working with students primarily at a Chinese university who are doing an English major, but all kinds of different specialisms within that, whether it's translation and interpreting, whether it's information technology, whether it's linguistics, why on earth would you do Shakespeare? If we think about sort of the dominant modes of language education, there's often this very instrumentalist emphasis. Communicative efficiency is very important. Employability is very important. The idea of language being useful in everyday situations seems very important. And if we think about Shakespeare in light of those, Shakespeare can seem very impractical, very out of date, and even very, very strange. And I'll talk about this word strange later. Technically, Shakespeare is written in English, even if it's early modern English, but it's often experienced by people as foreign. And I say that as someone who in school was a huge lover of literature, but really did not like Shakespeare at all. I did a literature degree as my first degree at university. I tried to avoid Shakespeare wherever I could. And it was only actually when I was forced to start doing a bit of teaching of Shakespeare when I was at a university in China that I actually thought, maybe there is something going on here. But certainly I have a great deal of skepticism in some ways towards Shakespeare. And as one of my participants described Shakespeare, they talked about it being a foreign language in foreign language. So this is a Chinese learner of English. So all of that makes it sound like you should never do Shakespeare with students who are learning English. But this student who said a foreign language in foreign language, he actually mentioned that in the process of talking about how much he enjoyed doing Shakespeare and how much he got out of Shakespeare. So let's have a think about that. And first of all, I'm going to talk about it in relation to strangeness and the idea of whether or not strangeness is actually a bad thing when it comes to languages, when it comes to anything, really. Today, we might think about strangeness as being to do with unfamiliarity or weirdness. But actually, in the early modern English in which Shakespeare was writing, that word strange meant lots of other things as well. It did mean foreign, but it also could mean rare, singular, exceptional, special, particular, or very great. And so what I'm partly trying to do with my use of Shakespeare is to capitalize on some of these different ideas of what strangeness could actually mean, and the idea that maybe it's not a bad thing, that something might seem unfamiliar, but it could also seem very special, very interesting because of that. And so one of the things that we have to think about if we're thinking about using Shakespeare in a language, in an English learning environment, for example, is can we think of Shakespeare as authentic material in some way? And of course, we need here to think about, well, who actually are a language's authentic speakers anyway? I'm trying desperately to avoid talking about native and non-native speakers. One, obviously, because of the problems with those concepts, but also so you don't have to see me going like this and doing the air quotes every time I say native or non-native. But of course, the idea that if you're learning English, you are somehow learning the language of England or Britain or the UK more widely is just a completely, today untenable, out of date, distorted kind of idea. So if we're not thinking about authenticity as regards to a sort of cultural heritage, how might we think about Shakespeare as authentic material? Well, I've drawn a lot in my work on the ideas of Lidicote and Scarino. And when they're talking about authentic material, they're especially thinking about, authenticity as depending on what you actually do with the materials. So for instance, authenticity of purpose. Does it have some kind of extrinsic purpose, or does it have some kind of intrinsic interest? And certainly I would say that Shakespeare has that kind of intrinsic interest. It can really grab learners' attention and hold it and inspire them in certain ways if it's taught in the right way. Does it have some kind of authenticity of response or task? And here we don't have to think about this as being something that students would necessarily do in their everyday lives at work, for example, but as a way in which there is a certain sincerity in what they are doing. There is a genuine interest, genuine stakes in what they're doing. And as you'll see later on in this talk, when I share some examples of my participating students, they were really, really invested in these tasks. And then we can also think about maybe authenticity of conditions. And of course, again, here, you might think, well, Shakespeare is surely absolutely useless for, conversations in the real world. If you're going to go and work in a bank, or you need to find out where the toilet is when you're on holiday, you might think the last thing you need is Shakespearean language. But of course, what students are doing here doesn't have to just be learning vocabulary or learning forms that they can then repeat. It can be also in part in terms of their wider understanding of language, of culture, and especially of this idea of breaking some of those things down, questioning some of their own assumptions about what is authentic linguistically or culturally, and thinking about how they actually approach things that might seem strange. And here, I also make use of Lidicote and Scarino's references to Pulvinus's work, and he talks about this Russian formalist notion of defamiliarization, or ostranenie, this idea of art as being able to make the familiar strange, to make us see things in another way. And Pulvinus talks about, in language classes, perhaps using texts that are to do with immigration, or texts that are to do with, say, science fiction, as a way of having this defamiliarization of culture. But actually Shakespeare, being 400 plus years old, written in this English, but not quite the English we're used to today, I actually find this works very, very well in terms of that defamiliarization. So what I'm trying to do in my teaching and in my research is combine what are called active approaches to Shakespeare, sometimes called rehearsal room approaches, and an intercultural perspective on language teaching and learning. And I'm not going to take up too much time talking about these, but I just want to mention them kind of briefly to give you an idea, because as I said, I'm very aware we've got a very interdisciplinary group here today. So active or rehearsal room approaches. These are basically comprise a wide range of expressive, creative and physical activities. They recognize that Shakespeare wrote his plays for performance and that his scripts are completed by enactment of some kind. So it's this idea of using creative expressive means, putting the plays on their feet, pushing the chairs, pushing the desks back, and actually playing with the plays in a physical, expressive way. Where this sometimes becomes problematic is we can see a hint of in the next sentence here. The dramatic context demands classroom practices that are the antithesis of methods in which students sit passively without intellectual or emotional engagement. And this seems to set up this idea of kind of sitting at the desk, sitting on your chair as bad, as passive, standing up and doing these active methods as good, as interesting. And of course, it's much more complicated than that. Students can be actively interpreting when they're sitting down. There might be no active component in something when they're running around. So in my teaching, I'm trying to make sure that I don't fall into those kind of binaries. And in my research, I'm trying to make sure that I can actually provide some kind of evidence of if we're talking about something being done actively by students. So I'm going to skip through this bit just because I really want to be able to spend enough time to give you some examples of the students actually doing this kind of stuff. But if you're looking for a sort of theoretical rationale for rehearsal room approaches, I would really recommend the work of Joe Winston, who, full disclosure, I should say, was one of my PhD supervisors. And he looks at the way that the Royal Shakespeare Company, in their education work, kind of leverage different kinds of learning, everything from learning through playing to learning through the body to even things like learning through beauty, and very importantly, learning together. And what you'll see, I hope, in the examples that I share later is the way that this is very playful, very experiential, very, very embodied, but also very, very collaborative. The other thing that I'm going to go through quite quickly, but I would definitely recommend, if you're not familiar with it, having a look at their work in detail. Liddicoat and Scarino, who I mentioned earlier, their intercultural perspective on language teaching and learning. And what I found when I looked at this is there was actually a lot of crossover between what they were talking about with how to approach language teaching and learning interculturally, and what Winston was talking about with active or rehearsal room Shakespeare, the importance of active construction and students making connections. So actively going about, negotiating meanings, working collaboratively, working creatively. Liddicoat and Scarino mentioned the importance of social interaction, but also things like reflection and things like responsibility. So there is an ethical dimension to this. And as we'll hopefully also see later, in some of the discussions that happened in the classrooms, even though we were talking about fictional characters, fictional work, there was clearly a moral, ethical dimension that the students were achieving through their engagement with Shakespeare. So getting onto the project that I'm talking about today itself. So it was an ethnomethodological study of Shakespeare workshops at a Chinese university. So I did a series of 14 practical Shakespeare workshops when I was exploring some of the kind of active or rehearsal room methods I was talking about before. There was a big collaborative emphasis, and there was also an intercultural emphasis. The participants were undergraduates and some postgraduates, mostly from the English faculty of a foreign studies university in southern China. So these foreign studies universities in China, they're dedicated to language and culture education. In the case of the institution I was at, I was in the English faculty, but they also had, faculties of other European languages, Asian languages. They taught many, many different languages. And because of this as well, students were expected to have at least one second foreign language. So it was quite common for the students in this project to speak 3 or 4 different languages. So possibly a couple of Chinese languages, English, then maybe Korean, Japanese, French, or Spanish. As well as the students, there was someone who was far less multilingually competent, so myself as practitioner and researcher. The data, as a kind of ethnomethodological case study, there were all kinds of different kinds of data. There was the workshop recordings. I did interviews with the students, which were kind of extended conversations. There was written feedback, my research journal, materials that we had in class, and all kinds of other things to draw on. And just before I move on, a quick note about languages and names. As I've mentioned, this was a foreign studies university, students who spoke many different languages, but in this case, they were studying English. And because we were in the English faculty, because we were doing Shakespeare, we did the workshops generally in English, but the students were also encouraged to bring in and make use of any other languages that they knew. At one point, we had a session where we had students doing Shakespearean sonnets, Shakespeare poems in Vietnamese, in Japanese, as well as in Cantonese and in Mandarin. So it was a very multilingual context. In terms of the names, obviously the names you're going to see in the rest of this talk are pseudonyms, but one thing you'll notice is that some of them are Chinese names, some of them appear to be English names. And this is because what I've done is tried to reflect in my pseudonyms the choices that the students made in terms of what they asked me to refer to them as. And this is something that I discuss in my PhD research in more detail, but the fact that you had interesting situations where students would sometimes ask other students to refer to them by a Chinese name, possibly ask me as the foreigner to refer to them by an English or other name. But sometimes that would change, especially sometimes when they realized actually I could speak maybe quite a lot more Chinese than they thought at first, having met other foreigners in China. Anyway, that's a story for another time. So just to say a few words about the ethnomethodological perspective that I was using. So for those of you who aren't so familiar, I imagine many of you will be very familiar, I know, with conversation analysis, maybe with MCA, but I've really tried to emphasize the ethnomethodological foundations of these in my work, the way I'm thinking about the project as a whole. So ethnomethodology aims to recast humans as sense makers or interpreters of the world, rather than as vehicles for the operation of generalized norms, in other words, cultural dopes. So one of the things I really wanted to avoid was just treating my students as Chinese students, as if they were somehow all the same, or this culturally monolithic group. They were from very different parts of China, had very different, backgrounds in terms of family, socio-economic status, things like this. And, some of them spoke Cantonese at home, some of them spoke Mandarin at home, some of them spoke other Chinese languages. So they were a very, very diverse group. And I was much more interested in thinking about how we made sense of our identities to each other than about kind of trying to put us into boxes beforehand. And I also took this ethnomethodological idea of social order as something done by people, not simply something that's done to them. And that also extended to what we were doing educationally. So I was treating lessons, tasks, engagement, learning, even teachers and students, not simply as just being there as educational facts, but as being constituted by the participants. So as part of this ethnomethodological perspective, I made use of CA and also membership categorization analysis as well. So CA, I was really looking at how how the kind of educational interactions were organized, sequentially, topically, how was this actually done? Secondly, with MCA, I was really thinking about how we were using different categories to or invoking different categories, negotiating what they might mean, and then using them to do certain things. So Housley and Fitzgerald here talk about these categorization and local reasoning practices as being a display and accomplishment of doing society. And of course, here we were also doing education, we were doing drama workshops. And I've put those two little stars there because whether we're talking about CA or MCA, of course, as most of the recent work that you'll be familiar with does, it remembers embodied contact. It's not just talk. And you're going to see in some of the examples I show you later how important what might be described, Mondada wouldn't be happy with this, but kind of non-verbal conduct, what's going on with that. So to get on to Shakespeare and the students and the actual workshops themselves, it was very important that I was thinking about this in terms of re-specifying Shakespeare as something constructed by, understood by the students themselves, not simply my assumptions about what they thought. And I tried to get at this in various different ways, remembering, of course, that none of these things are somehow magically, concretely what the students think about Shakespeare in a fixed way. In all cases, they are students going about trying to convey something, construct some kind of meaning in interaction or in dialogue with something else. So here we have a translation before the workshops. I thought that Shakespeare was a very great world-renowned dramatist. Another student saying, ancient, widely praised works, enduring, old and difficult to understand languages, very famous stories. A lot of people studied him, but this doesn't necessarily sound very enthusiastic at this point. Although I have not read Shakespeare's works extensively, I have always respected this famous writer. And this is something I came across quite a lot, students referring to this status that Shakespeare has, this idea that somehow he's a very great artist, even if they hadn't necessarily read or watched or performed much of his work. And so it's important to remember that for some of my students, they saw Shakespeare as irrelevant and very obscure. They came to the workshops not because they were interested in Shakespeare, but maybe they were interested in drama workshops. Maybe some of their friends were going. Maybe they wanted to do something a bit different in English. Some cases, they maybe even wanted to have more classes with a foreign teacher. So for some students, even though they were in a Shakespeare workshop, like me when I was at university, they weren't really interested in Shakespeare. In other cases, though, engaging with Shakespeare actually enabled students or encouraged them to think about things that were very much out of the ordinary. So one of the students, who I'll refer to here as Sylvia, talked about Shakespeare as providing a personal and artistic epiphany. She actually used that word in English. Another student, Yan Qing, talked about Shakespeare as allowing her to ponder kind of philosophical questions in ways that her family would tell her were thinking too much or too unrealistic or even insane if she tried to bring them up talking to her family. So Shakespeare gave her this opportunity. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this session is show you some examples of how the students were not just doing Shakespeare, but doing things with Shakespeare in certain ways. And if we're thinking about doing, but also doing being, we can think about doing Shakespeare, doing things with Shakespeare, as I've mentioned. That included doing learning, as you'll see. And if we're thinking about doing being ordinary, where Sachs talks about this ordinariness as not necessarily just a quality that we have, but as an interactional achievement, us doing being ordinary when we describe our lives or describe a particular situation. I also in this project looked at when students were doing being intercultural, actually making different languages, different cultural frames relevant, and then negotiating how, or indeed even whether they were relevant, things to do with their identity, for example. And even I've wondered about, are there situations in which the students are doing being Shakespearean, in some ways displaying, especially through their embodied contact, that they are doing something which is out of the ordinary and maybe even quite different from the kind of acting that they might be doing in a kind of role play situation in their normal classes. So here's one example, before we get into the actual video and audio, of a student doing something with Shakespeare. So this is a PhD student called Jackie. And what he's doing here is he was giving some written feedback on King Lear. But what was really interesting, and you can see the bit that I've highlighted here, is that in order to give his feedback on King Lear and a question that I asked about it, he's actually bringing in quotes from Hamlet, from another Shakespeare play. So he talks about, under the temptation of power and wealth, people are easily disoriented, and the native hue of love and trust will become sicklied o'er by other distractions. So he's taking something that we talked about in another session and using it to explain his interpretation of another Shakespeare play. So this kind of displaying of his understanding. And I've got another example now, which I'm going to play you. This is from one of the interviews, and we hear a student, again, doing this, but not in writing, actually in speech.
Yes, because there are a lot of famous quotes in Hamlet, like I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself as an infinite king. But yeah, that made me feel it kind of it's very empowering in some sort of way.
Okay, and what? Yeah. So, and you mean in your own life? Yes. That makes you think of
like I could be count myself as infinite king, even if I bounded in this. Yeah, that kind of comparison.
Yeah. Okay, so that the bit which missed out there, this Lingwai, was the pseudonym I gave the university that we were at there. But as he's using this quote from Hamlet, this for me was quite an unexpected reference. But what he was doing was using this quote, which obviously he would assume that I was familiar with, but also linking it to some common knowledge that we had. He knew that I'd lived on the campus and that I appreciated the fact that this could be quite a claustrophobic environment. But the fact is that for this particular student, he felt that the sort of intercultural, international atmosphere, the intellectual atmosphere at this university gave him an awful lot more freedom. It was empowering, as he called it, compared to his previous college. So again, we see a student, taking a particular quote from Shakespeare and then using it for their own kind of purposes, linking it to their own lives. So what I'm going to do for the final bit, as I show you some more examples, is to give you some kind of share one of the approaches that I might take to doing a bit of Shakespeare, go through some of the different stages and show you some of the things that the students are doing as they're doing Shakespeare, but also doing things with Shakespeare. And the example I'm going to use is a workshop where we were exploring this very, very famous speech from Shakespeare's As You Like It, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. So it's quite a long speech, but we explored it in various different ways. And one of the questions which of course came up was how this might be relevant. The fact that Shakespeare talks about one man in his time. Most of my students in this class were female. How did they respond to that idea? Did they see this as being very gendered, even patriarchal kind of presentation? what did they feel was left out? How did they actually go about understanding something that was written so many years ago in a very, very different cultural context? Well, we went through various different phases in this particular workshop. I'm not going to talk about the warm-up today, but warm-ups are incredibly important when you're doing this kind of drama work in the language classroom. They signal that you're doing something very, very different. They get the students physically warmed up, but also kind of mentally, emotionally warmed up, and trusting each other so that they are actually happy co-constructing, in some cases, fictional frames and ratifying those fictional frames. That can be quite a threatening thing to do. People can feel very embarrassed or very vulnerable sometimes, and especially if you're doing it in a foreign language. So warm-up's very important. Once we've done the warm-up, we did something called speaking in a circle, which I'll talk about in a moment. There was some concept checking, a bit like you might get in a traditional or even old-fashioned language class. Then there was some enactment, and then there was some discussion. So this is the speaking in a circle. I'm not going to show you video, but what we were doing here was passing the speech around person by person, sometimes just a word each, sometimes just a line each. And as you can see the students doing here, as they passed it on, they held their speech in one hand, they put their hand on the shoulder of the person they were talking to, and they looked into their eyes and really tried to pass this on, like it was something important, like they were actually passing on something exciting. Not acting yet, because they didn't know what the speech meant. But in doing this, this allows the teacher to do a number of different things. It takes the pressure off individual students. It makes bringing the speech to life a collaborative thing. And also as the teacher, it allows you to hear things that students might be having problems with that you can then flag up later without having to sort of identify any particular student as being one who's made a mistake, even though that's not the particular way I was approaching it here. So we passed the speech around several times in different directions until the students had heard the whole thing, were much more familiar with it. We then started to do some concept checking work. And this is where the fact that I was a participant and the fact that I was doing this ethnomethodological perspective, one of the things it really made me realize was just how much embodied work I was doing in the classroom that I'd not actually realized. Just got a couple of examples here, but there was so much miming going on that I didn't realize I was actually doing. And in some cases, there were examples of concept checking where students and I were addressing the meaning of a particular phrase or expression that they didn't know. And we were doing this, sometimes 2 or 3 students around the circle, doing it via gestures as well. On the left, you can see me doing this thing about spectacles of one of the characters, the elderly characters described in the speech. On the right, you can see me kind of miming trousers, pointing out that a particular bit of it related to the legs, the very skinny legs in these old wide trousers of one of the elderly characters they were talking about. So that's one of the importances of the embodied nature of the concept checking. One of the other things that looking at these videos showed me was just how collaborative the concept checking was, even if I came out of it sometimes thinking, did I do too much talking there? Was there too much teacher talk going on there? So I'm going to show you a video now of a little snippet of this workshop where some of the students were talking about a particular word where they weren't quite sure what this word was. And it's this word here, S-A-N-S. So Olche, if you would mind just... Yes. Thank you. So I'll go back to my presentation. So I should just note, when you're doing this kind of work, obviously, if you haven't been filming your own teaching before, it is quite a frightening, sometimes quite disconcerting thing. Apart from obviously looking at myself from behind I realized just how thin on top I was actually going. But also you do start to think about, mistakes that you've made in a particular way. You do have to get over that. So at one point when I was talking about, is it Jaques or is it Jacques? I improvised on the spot. I made a reference to Jacques Cousteau, who is a person who none of my students would have any idea who it was. So you don't always get these things right. Later on, also, when I'm talking about, we would say Jaques, afterwards looking at this, I was thinking, who do I mean by we? Do I mean native English speakers? Do I mean kind of Shakespeare people? And that's, certainly one of the things that I became aware of that I can try and think about doing differently in my teaching in future. But what I want to talk about is just the first bit of this here, where one of the students says, what about the last line, the song? And what we get is a number of different pronunciations, some of them very French, some of them very kind of English, and we get students picking up on these things. So what begins as a query from one student actually goes on to be constructed or co-constructed by multiple students as a learnable, as something which is important to actually address. And by the end of it, we've kind of tried this out together. So if we think this is the French word son or sons, if it means without, let's try that, without teeth, without eyes, without taste. It does work. And we have a different student at the end saying, yes, that does work, from the student at the start who's actually raised the query. So the concept checking was very much not just a kind of dialogue, no matter how much I was talking, between myself and the students. It was much more like what Schwab would describe as a multi-log. After the concept checking, we moved on to enactment. And it's really important to stress here that when we're talking about enactment in active Shakespeare, this is not necessarily about performing for an audience. In some cases, we would rehearse things or try things out that no one else ever got to see. They were never actually performed. It was in many ways about embodiment and about interpretive choices, as I'm about to try and show you. So we went through the whole of that speech with the 7 different ages, and different groups of students did their own interpretations. So don't worry too much here if you're not familiar with the speech, but hopefully the pictures will give you an idea. So we had the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. We had the whining schoolboy creeping like snail unwillingly to school. You can see the schoolboy being dragged there. We had the lover sighing like furnace. A soldier full of strange oaths. We had the justice or the judge in fair round belly with good cape unlined. So this idea of a justice or a judge who's having a very, very comfortable material existence, possibly because they're receiving bribes or making money in some kind of nefarious way. We had the lean and slippered pantaloon, so this elderly figure. And then finally, second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. And the students in this group, as they collapsed to the floor, one of their other members turned the light off to give it this kind of finality. So in this case, we did have a performance, but what was more important almost was the work that went into leading up to it. So here we have an example. You can see in this picture, we've got the schoolboy group, Shihong from the schoolboy group talking to the lover group. And these 2 students who were doing the lover were really, really struggling with what to do. And it's not that clear on the audio because all of the students were working in a group at this point. But what you can see is very clearly a suggestion being made, being taken up, and then later it's used in their performance. So the script is handed over, and Benny was clearly saying, I don't know what to do about this. Shihong at this point mimes going down on one knee as if proposing. She stands up, she hands back Benny's script, And at this point, Benny kind of goes, ah, koi, like kind of, yeah, we could do that. That effectively means. She returns to her group, and then Benny goes down on one knee. And we saw this in the lover sighing like furnace in the actual performance. Another example I'd show you here was the soldier, who were another group who initially was struggling slightly with how to do this. And there was an interesting choice about how to present the soldier. Are we thinking about a soldier 400 years ago? Are we even thinking about literally a soldier? Or is this just actually about a younger man who's very jealous or sudden and quick in quarrel, as Shakespeare mentions it? But we also had some more local elements coming in. So if you look on the left, we have a student doing a salute with kind of her palm open, but on the right, in the center, we have a student doing a kind of closed fist salute that's much more associated with the Communist Party in China. And certainly there was something very interesting going on here with the way that they were kind of mocking the figure of the soldier, but also including some local elements. There was something quite interesting, potentially quite provocative going on there. Here we have the group who did the justice, and it's not so clear maybe from this particular photo, but one of the discussions they had was about if they've got female students performing a male character, especially a maybe overbearing male character, they needed to have this character man-spreading. So earlier on in their performance, Paz, the student who was performing as the justice, was sitting down, really man-spreading. And they had this discussion about the fact that this, is this how we represent a man taking up more space? So all kinds of things happened in the performance, which then fed through to the final thing I'm going to talk about, which is the discussion. And here I'd like to just draw on Freebody's idea of socio-cultural talk. So Freebody talks about 3 different types of talk that happen in the drama classroom. Pedagogical logistic talk, which is basically to do with making the lesson happen as a lesson institutionally, so the way that activities are organized. She talks about in-role talk, so what happens when the students are displaying to other students that they are in role, that they are performing as someone else. But what I'm going to show you here is socio-cultural talk, and this is what happened in the discussion. So Freebody talks about this as being concerned with the cultural, social, and moral potential of the lesson, and involving shared accounts and public reasoning, which are generally oriented to the cultural, social, moral aspects of the drama as a socio-cultural event, rather than as an institutionalized classroom event. So this is where students are really taking something and making it relevant to them. So I'm just going to pause there, and I'm going to show you the last bit of video I'm going to show you. So again, Oljo, if you don't mind there. So I'm not going to talk through every bit of it, because we could spend a long time in a data session going over what was going on there. But what I found very interesting in terms of categorization was the way that the students worked together collaboratively to try to, invoke and negotiate what these categories might mean and who they might actually relate to. So in the pictures here, you can see Paz, indicating physically we. So she's talking about her group here, the 3 students who are actually talking. We have to find our identity. And they talk about the fact that as 4th-year students who are about to graduate, they're losing the identity of student that they have now. They need to try and find some other kind of identity. But of course, is that something that's only related to graduates, to students? So a little bit later on, Evelyn, the student on the right, very quietly says Chinese are all have this problem. So she's making it clear this is not just graduates. This is maybe something that everyone in China has, perhaps in their early 20s. And there's a very, very complex thing going on with the way that they are exchanging glances, aligning in that way physically in terms of gaze as they negotiate what these things might mean. And you saw at the end the way that Sylvia in the middle and Evelyn, so I'm trying to avoid using their real names, Sylvia and Evelyn work together to kind of enumerate these challenges. We don't know where we are, who we are, where we were at, where we will go, and things like this. And what particularly then interested me at the end was what happens when Sylvia looks at her script and says, what we will do. We don't know whether we'll have a fair round belly or not. And of course, this idea of the fair round belly, so she refers to, she quotes from the particular age that they were looking at, but that fair round belly, we had an earlier discussion where it wasn't simply about material wealth. It was also about this idea of corruption. Are they going to have to face corruption? Ethically, where are they going to go? How are they going to make their way in the world? Are they going to, pursue a career in which they can feel proud of how they've done? Or are they going to have to negotiate possibly some ethically quite difficult situations as part of the next stages of their lives? So I was really struck here by the way that Sylvia takes something quite an obscure reference in a way from a play written more than 400 years ago and really makes it relevant to her life and the lives of some of her fellow students in 21st century China. So this is what I'm really talking about with re-specifying Shakespeare, with what the students were doing with Shakespeare. And a reference that I hope would be really useful for some of you here is a forthcoming book by Amberine Dadaboy and Neda Medizadeh, where they talk about the difference between relevance and salience in Shakespeare. So instead of always thinking about how we as the teacher can make Shakespeare relevant, we need to trust our students and find out what is salient for them. And in fact, it could be possibly quite troubling aspects of Shakespeare that they want to talk about, whether it's the racism or the sexism, the misogyny that you find in a lot of the work. So very briefly then, just to conclude, hopefully this has given you some ideas about the way that re-specifying Shakespeare as an accomplishment of students can actually show the variety of things that it can be used to mean and to do, even if we think of him as being the kind of boring old or ubiquitous Shakespeare. Hopefully it's shown that doing Shakespeare through active and rehearsal room approaches does actually provide powerful opportunities for students to make sense of Shakespeare, but also to make sense through Shakespeare, to show what is salient for them. Hopefully it's shown that Shakespeare can actually be an effective, authentic resource for intercultural teaching and learning if we expand our sense of what authentic might mean interculturally. And then finally, as well as reminding me of how bald I'm going at the back, hopefully this has also shown that if you look at your own practice as a teacher using ethnomethodological approaches, CA, MCA, it can actually give you really important insights into your own practice. And when I was talking about later, earlier, where sometimes it can be quite threatening and you feel, certainly I feel very uncomfortable sometimes about mistakes that I've made. One of the really great things about CA and MCA is it concentrates on what's actually analytically observable. So rather than beating myself up about what do I think my students were thinking about there, or were they thinking, I'd done this wrong, or I was being an idiot, or I was being really Eurocentric, you can actually look at what is analytically observable and then see how that can be useful for your future practice. So thank you very much for listening there and for bearing with me. I have a feeling I may be on my own on that bridge in the middle of, between those two land masses, but hopefully in the discussion we can build a few more of those connections. I've got my email and Twitter handle here. Also, so if anyone has any questions, please do get in touch with me afterwards if we don't have a chance to discuss it now. The other thing as well, so I'm just going to stop sharing. The other thing as well, I've prepared a list of references in just as a Word document. So I'll send that to Olcay, but also if anyone would like it, please email me and I can send it to you as well, because I'm trying to move away from what I always used to do, which is do a talk and then at the end of it go, here are my references, and then they're gone. And if you're not quick on the draw with a pen, you've lost it. So please do get in touch with any queries or if you'd like that references. But thank you very much, everyone, for listening, for bearing with me.